Taiwei, good morning. It's kind of hard to start with our introductions, and it's hard to talk about oneself too much. But my name is José Barreiro. I'm Taino from Cuba, and I have been in this work for many, many, many years. I was really glad to listen to Dan Longboat this morning. It reminded me of our early days in the mid-1970s, traveling with the Haudenosaunee, at that time out of Akwesasne, Kanyangahaga, White Roots of Peace. That goes back a ways. It started in 1969. It reminded me of the early efforts of movement. I was really touched to hear you talk the way you did, Dan. It was like hearing Tommy Porter and Corbett Sundown and all the old guys from all that time, and the great clan mothers of the Audrey Shenandoah out of Onondaga, and all the folks that moved about in the late 60s, even in the 50s. We're talking 60, 70 years ago, almost a century. For the young people, it's good to know how far this goes back from the traditional ways that Dan very aptly described for us. It's not easy to transfer how the intricacies and the cohesion of the life, the traditional life, as we can call it. I know the terms get confused many times, how we use them academically. But we know when we speak of tradition, we kind of know what we mean. And that those old teachings and old ways that were very current and are still current, if we could only achieve that again. And we move in that direction from the time when none of this was possible. Not that long ago. Some places outlawed to even get up and talk on culture, on one's ways, being positive, being something that can give a life, can give meaning to life. And without meaning, life starts to diminish. And so we had great meaning in all these cultures. My own culture, the Haudenosaunee, I married into the Haudenosaunee waters many, many years ago, 1976 to be exact. Same year I met Larry McDermott. We hardly recall that meeting, but it was in Guatemala, in the Maya country. 76, that's almost 50 years. I met him. He came down into Guatemala as I did with two different groups, didn't know each other. After the big earthquake in Guatemala in 76, killed 20,000 people in one night. The vast majority Maya people living in their traditional homes sometimes with roofs that were the old-time Spanish tile, and all that collapsed in one night and just killed people, left them in their home graves for valley after valley after valley. The Mohawk chiefs in 75 had traveled to Guatemala to meet the Maya old-timers. Imagine that, by truck, old school bus. In the 50s, the long hairs were traveling around. Go to talk to the old-timers at that time. In the 50s, the long hairs were going around in old station wagons from reservation to reservation. That's what they called them, the long hairs, the old-timers, wanting to talk, get the conversation going again. Things that were difficult to find the words anymore, but they did. They found it. And they began that conversation that later on we heard of AIM and we heard of the American Indian movement and the takeovers. Wounded Knee is 50 years ago. My wife Gudgy was arrested going to Wounded Knee 50 years ago and thrown in a ditch, put cuffs on her. She's still battling. You may know of her, Gudgy Cook. She's a midwife. Willocos, midwife. So we go back a ways, and we were there we both brought groups. I went with the White Roots of Peace group out of Akwesasne. I got a call, and I was living in Minneapolis to accompany the group to Guatemala. And so we met at the Longhouse at Akwesasne in early June and traveled there. These slides are not going to follow my talk very well because they just didn't quite work out. So I'll just try to follow Dan's way as much as I can. But it was an effort to help out. And so out of the Longhouse at Akwesasne, which was having its own troubles at the time, a group was organized to go back where they had met people the year before. And so nurses and agricultural people and herbalists and young people that had muscle and carpenters, and we went in. I remember Larry's group from the farm in Tennessee going out of that valley that day, and we were moving in to start our work there. It was my first opportunity to meet with the Maya people, the old traditional people, with the folks from Akwesasne. As you were talking, Dan, you were mentioning some concepts, some ways of thinking that are reflected in those Mayan traditions that we shared with them at the time, and that since then our family has become very close to the Mayan calendar days. You spoke about that intelligence, that male intelligence, that is very bright, but it can really get in trouble if it doesn't be connected properly. And they speak of that yesterday. So, the day was emotion. They call it that. It was a day of much agitation, activity, and especially on the male side. And then today is Kih, it's the Deer Day, and that's the leadership. Maya, from way down in the Central American forest, and Haudenosaunee up here, the deer represents leadership. You know, you have these little things that you connect from different places, and you wonder how they do. And that teaching about male intelligence is wonderful, but it's good at throwing things. It's good at, which kind of reflects war, reflects defense. It reflects that kind of activity. And it's troublesome because of that, because it can get too high in itself. And that's the teaching for the day yesterday. Then today shifts to real leadership with the Deer Day. It's a healing day. It's a day of also of wind and of putting your face against the wind and clearing your nostrils, cleaning your lungs. And every day like that has a teaching, and many are correspond to these longhouse ceremonies and Sundance out in the plains. It corresponds. You know, we've had traditional people among the Maya who have been invited into the Sundance by elders who don't just invite anybody and give him space to put his altar and clean the dancers before they go in the circle. And so you have these connections, and that's what we kind of ran into in these trips. In '76 was that trip to Guatemala, which was, again, many native nations working together on their own. No money involved, no NGOs. Collected money from here and there, went down. No organization, people to people. It was going on all over Indian country. It was a precursor to the big explosion of the 70s. In the United States, it was symbolized by Wounded Knee, the takeover of the Wounded Knee village, where the big massacre occurred in 1890. 73, that was a takeover. A year before was a takeover of the BIA building in Washington, and in the midst of a presidential campaign, all responded to with guns. And people began to be lost to that movement because of the violence. So all that was going on. We were young people, mixing in, helping out here, helping out there, becoming more and more militant as things went along, because we were getting our faces cracked too, and things. The police response was always drastic at that time. Drastic, you know. Any native folks raising up, they got hit hard. And after we made our acquaintances in Guatemala, the time. The very next year was the Geneva Conference of 1977. We were talking yesterday about some of these United Nations protocols that are still moving about. The first meeting was in 77 in Geneva. First time that Native delegations were ever able to send their own people to represent themselves at the United Nations. Small meeting in the context of the United Nations work, you know, it's just huge operations. But it was a significant meeting, the first one that happened that way. And again, within all of the Native movement, the human touch, there was a chief that came out of the Cayugas, Skahe, back in 1921, 1922. It's the first one that went to the League of Nations to try to represent the Native nations into the world thinking. He wasn't accepted. He couldn't speak to the League of Nations at the time. But he was able to speak to Geneva. The city of Geneva received him, developed a protocol just with him, his action to go to Geneva as a Confederacy chief, protesting Canadian impositions in 6 nations. While he was there, Geneva was the entity that was willing to receive him. And Geneva's got its own importance as a city in all these protocols. And when we got there in 77, to the chagrin of Russell Means and the American Indian movement militant side, the Europeans said, we don't know how to receive Indians. But the mayor of Geneva says in an old drawer he's got a protocol of how to receive the 6 nations. Condolence ceremony. Edge of the woods condolence. He pulled that out. So they can't do things without protocol. The dress, the thing, you know, everything's got to be just right. Same among our folks, but that's intricate. And the mayor, elderly man, received, I remember our delegation was led by Oren Lyons, Audrey Shenandoah, Old Man Shenandoah, all that whole group, it's all gone, mostly gone now. And after the reception, after the protocol, the mayor tells Oren this story. I was standing right behind Oren, so I heard it. He said, when I was a little boy, I was here like 7 years old when the sky came through. So he actually met this guy that went. And when he passed me, he saw that I was disappointed, and he turned back around, and he pulled into his pocket, and he just pulled out a coin he had, and he gave it to me. He still had that coin, and he told that story. So all that happened in Geneva had not happened because of a big speech. In 1977, what happened was because of that gesture of kindness. A gesture from an older man to a little boy. That's how movement works. Ultimately, that's how movement works. It's those intricate connections. I'm way off my topic, but I got inspired by Dan and the stories he was telling. Those folks that we met in Guatemala, before I get to my own story, we can pull up. This is good. This is a good shot. They came back to us about 5 years later. Showed up at my house, a man from Guatemala, Maya Kekchi, traditional spiritual man. Young man then, sent out to meet up with the traditional Indians up here, because in Guatemala, between the time that we had been there and seen some beautiful Indian country, village after village after village of high corn, good beans, great gardens, clean roads between the villages, elders that gather the kids every morning to hear their dreams. Those old-time things were going on. People didn't even use money. They knew what money was, but they said, well, we don't really use it up in these mountains. We never. So you trade for food, for whatever. I had a good pass at the folks, meeting folks and getting around. Wrote about it for the Akwesasne Note. Some may remember the Akwesasne Notes here. First Native movement newspaper published out of the Mohawk Reservation, out of the Mohawk Longhouse, all through the 70s and early 80s. He came to tell a horrible story. The massacres were on. In 1982, a new dictator in Guatemala, an evangelical man, one of these new sects, but a dictator, a general, began a campaign of eradication of Indian villages. And they razed to the ground more than 400 villages. Men, women, children razed to the ground, killed. Horrible things began to happen in Guatemala. And the real destruction was not even in the time of the conquest. It happened right in the 1980s. 1980s, not that long ago. Massacre after massacre after massacre. Assassination of the traditional leaders, of the spiritual leaders. So they came up and they were all caught up between the left and the right. And nobody could make sense for them. They wanted to meet the traditional Indians. And that's how that relationship began with the Longhouse at Akwesasne. That spread then to the Grand Council at Onondaga at the time. He was invited to speak there. And that began a relationship that has lasted many years. And I speak of that because we speak of international development like it's some kind of institution. And for us, at least the work we've done through Plenty and other institutions, it's about the folks. It's about people you meet, and suddenly you hear they fell in hard times. And what can you do about it? How can you move on that? issues of life and death. And I spent several years documenting, going to Guatemala and going to the places and documenting the massacres that had gone on. It's work that you want to forget because it was that horrible. But it involved the North too, and it began to cement those relationships. As the war abated in the 90s and into the new century, it left behind a horrible panorama of very, very traumatized people. People have been run over and over. And yet, he still found the kindness. He still found the heart. And what they would say was, no matter how hard they hit us, we don't want to lose our humanity. We don't want to hate. We want to defend ourselves, but we don't want to hate. Because that's what they want. That's where they want us. It's in that perpetual hate. And again, you get these lessons from the culture. It's not political thinking. It's just from the culture. How the culture responds to real trauma. Because those are trauma issues of major proportions. A lot of people came north at the time. The whole migration thing that the United States rails about now, and Canada is beginning to be affected more and more by it, starts from those wars, mostly created by the United States. Starts from those wars. Villages that were just well put together in the way you were describing, where everything had a meaning, or every dance had very specific meaning to your life activities. And your life activities and your economy works from that spiritual meaning. And everybody is in pretty good shape. But they got turned over. The puzzle got turned over. And it's been 40 years now of working to build that puzzle back. Because there's resilience. And that's what, this is Cuba, but the one you had before, the daughter of that man that came up to make that denunciation, who became a very interesting character in many of our communities up here. His daughter has a project in Guatemala, and that's the project we do in Guatemala, is with her. She's gathering the knowledgeable elder women. Not elder women. My wife gets after me. Women elders. Women elders. And she has very keenly gathered the network of several dozen of the most, culture-bearing, culture-holding women elders in the Maya Quechí communities of Alta Verapaz. I wish I had everything well lined up, but it didn't work out with the map and so forth. And through doing that, she's been rebuilding community. Women elder herbalists, women elder midwives, very strong. Like you were saying about, somebody was mentioning this morning, midwifery. Midwifery is more than just a medical hands-on procedure. It's a way of life, and it's a very powerful rebuilding tool in our communities. It's the midwives, really, that are reteaching the families how to be. And down there, it's the same thing. It wasn't residential schools there. It was massacre, outright massacre, one after another after another. So people survived in the woods. Women became stronger and stronger as leaders as the men were disappearing. And all of that led to the people, the young women especially, such as Leonor, as you see here, begin their projects in a climate of very strong violence. She risks being kidnapped every day she goes out into the communities. This is rough community work. But she's reweaving her people, and this is a project that we support wholeheartedly, what she's doing. Advice on it as much as we can. Her father, who's a very strong spiritual man, also advises and puts through a lot of ceremony for her and for the work she's doing. When COVID hit and people were actually facing serious hunger issues, it was this network of women elders that pulled things back together, community after community in that area. Plagued with many issues, the people are still tied up. They're still working together to move it forward, knowing that they've lost big chunks of their culture to the war. But again, like you were saying, Dan, it's all there. It's not gone. It's just not in our hands right now. Well, how do we put it in our table? How do we put it in our circle again? How do we get it to work again? Not easy. Not easy because the way of life is different. The new young people are a whole lot different than we were as young people. And it's a whole new technology eating up their attention all the time. And you know, ceremony is about concentration. Ceremony is about concentration. Spiritual connection is about concentration. It's about return. Return and return and return. Greetings many times before it starts to happen. So, how do we do without your concentration as young people? How do we get some of that concentration back from the phones in your hands, which have a lot of information? We use them. We all use them, you know. But some of us learn how to concentrate before those kinds of interruptions happen in our lives. It used to be you could concentrate for 6-7 hours on something without a phone ringing. You know, it's a different world. But it attacks our concentration. And we need our concentration. The hunter needs concentration. The herbalist can't afford to be wrong. The bone setter can't afford to be wrong. Has to have his spiritual lined up with his knowledge, with his arms, with his hands. Any part of that broken, he could harm somebody. Concentration is the key. It's our wealth. So I just, that's my warning for the young people, you know that that's also a way of colonization, just the instrument itself. Yeah, you can turn a tank around and hit the enemy, but the instrument already changed your life. The use of the tank changed your life. So, adapt, resist. Adapt, resist. That's been our survival. You can't always just resist, they kill you. They're powerful. They're not running the world because they don't know what they're doing. They're not running the world because they're stupid. They're not running the world because they're peaceful. So you got to adapt, and you got to resist, and then you got to adapt, and then you got to resist, but you got to survive. And the old people always knew what to say when we used to talk about climate change and the activism that was necessary about doing something about climate change. I remember they say, prepare to meet the conditions. You're not going to change the world. You're not going to stop the white man. Prepare to meet the conditions. Prepare your people. From the inside, prepare your people. Prepare your children. Prepare to meet the conditions. See the objective reality, meet the condition. Use all your tools, but meet the condition. Because we all want to feed our kids. We all need that corn and beans, and we all need that deer meat. So prepare to meet the conditions was a major, major challenge. So Guatemala is around young women working with women elders. And they've done whatever they had to do. They've become builders, they've become gardeners, they've become herbalists, they know how to support the midwifery movements, and they're tying their people together in that region. That's that project described in general terms. Put some Cuba. My own folks, there you go, you found the right one. I got a good assistant, actually found the thing. Cuba is a whole other story. That's where I'm from. Taino, from eastern Cuba. Early in my life, I had a experience akin to the residential schools. I came home one day, and the next day I was sent to the United States to live with foster homes, to get away from communism. And it took me 18 years to get back home. But I accomplished that in 1978. And ever since then, coming to terms with the fact that in the Caribbean and in Cuba, indigenous is deemed to be extinct, does not exist. And yet our people are there. And I knew where they were. So I had a chance to go meet, especially Cacique Panchito and their particular communities in a region in the mountains between Guantanamo and the Baracoa, Santiago area in the eastern part of the country. And within all of that socialist system, very, very controlled political environment, not violent like Guatemala. They're not massacring people, but they know every move you make. The national security is very strong. Coupled to the fact that academics have been saying for 100 years doesn't exist. Academics work out of Havana in the western part of the country. That's the capital. That's where all that intellectual stuff happens. In the mountains, that's where the folks are. So over 30 years, I've had a chance to go home lots of time, and had a chance to work with Panchito, who asked me the first night we met, help me regather my people. We've scattered from the mountains now. We're all over the place. We still know where we are, but the economic conditions didn't allow for people to travel even 20, 30 miles to another town. People were very stuck in their areas. So we began that work of moving about, reconnecting the kinship families, doing a family count underneath the powers that be, underneath the attention of the powers that be, because that to do a count of Cuban people is a census, and a census needs to be issued by the national government, and the national government said there's no Indians, so how can there be a census of Indians? So we said, no, it's just a family. You couldn't say tribe, you couldn't say nation, otherwise the security was on you. So we've had to reinvent the terminology just to move it along. So who can object to a family counting its members? Well, the family happens to be about, at this moment's count, nearing about 16,000. Just Rojas Ramirez, there's a particular clan line. Doesn't even include folks from where I'm from, which are interconnected, and other people. But just from there, there's a family count which we think will round out more about 30,000. It's a tribe. It's a tribal rule is what it is. It's a bad rule. It's a nation. But we've had to work intelligently to never, ever create conflict. Build the people from the inside out. That's been the strategy. The conflict, you're going to lose. You build the people. When the people are ready, they make their next move. When they're ready, the next move comes. But don't work to lose, only to win, and make allies. Make allies. We've spent 30 years building alliances. And you build alliances with good relations, with sweet relations, with a little coin gesture. That's how you build an alliance that actually lasts. You gotta touch the heart. You gotta touch the heart. And you gotta touch the young people. And the elders have to be of one mind, as much as possible. They have to be of one mind, because elders can create trouble too. Elders know how to create trouble. And like they said, the devil said, I'm not double because I'm double. I'm double because I'm old. So we have to discipline our elders as well sometimes, say, hey, calm it down. Let's listen to the young people, huh? Because they're coming at us with all kinds of notions, and we gotta figure this out and incorporate, not just reject. So all those elements go into development. It's a human interaction. Within that, you have your goals. You have Cuba. There's a huge food crisis. I mean, serious food crisis. Hunger is really beginning now in a serious way. So the attention of the old folks, everybody's agriculture, planting, everybody plant. It's what the old people say here still, but we're surrounded in abundance of food. Not very good food most of the time, but we have abundant foods. But all of a sudden, if you don't find your evening meal for your kids, you got to do for yourself. But doing for yourself with your agriculture, that's the first step of sovereignty. If you don't feed yourself, you ain't sovereign. You're just working toward it, or you're pretending. Anyway, none of us are sovereign. We're moving toward sovereignty. We're trying to move toward sovereignty again. But if we pretend we're just sovereign, then our issues become silly issues among ourselves. We're nowhere near sovereignty. Territories need to be secured. Agriculture, food production needs to be there. The more traditional, the better, because that's what works. That's what works. Corn and beans, that's what works. In Cuba, corn and beans. What's saving the country right now? It's not the American foods. It's not what came from Europe. It's yuca, ñame, all the tubers, corn and beans, the old fruits. That's what's coming up. That's what's saving the country from starvation. Our old ways, reinterpreted, redone as best we can, but our old ways. Everywhere, it's the same story. It's the same story here. The old people knew it. The time is going to come when the white man ain't going to feed you. The time is going to come when the white man either can't or won't feed you. And you know what I mean by the white man. It's a state of mind. It's a state of mind. We know that. We're not talking about a race per se. We're talking about a state of mind. That's who feeds us right now. Puts that little sugar in our mouth. That's colonialism at its deepest level. That's who makes our world tick. Well, we have to adapt. We have to adapt. Sometimes you have to take in things. Keep your eye on it. That's the native culture. Keep your eye on it. But you adapt until you can make it yours. Put your own laws to it. If it doesn't fit, it's got to go. But it's not just outward rejection from where we were 500 years ago. It's who we are now, bringing up the old knowledge, bringing up the old values. Values and knowledge. That's been our ideology in Cuba. Valores y saberes. Values and knowledge. Nobody can accuse us of being capitalists, communists, socialists, terrorists. No. No, we're talking about the old people. But you know, the old people were a lot more radical than we even are, because they knew how to feed themselves. Nobody could tell them nothing, you know. They could feed themselves. So that's the challenge, and I love working with real challenge like that, because it's to see the economy improve. And if we can help them buy an old tractor because we got a little bit of first world money, that's what we're gonna do. And if we can figure out how to send them 50 machetes so they have the good new machetes again, that's what we're gonna do. It's just provide some tools. But it's easy work because they're already doing it. With Panchito, we did 30 years of moving around the country, all the scattered communities. Everybody remembered each other. Everybody was doing the same things. Everybody wondered where old this guy was and where my old cousin here, and they had just scattered. And so we're just in the thrust of that reconnection of all of these communities. And then this new technology happens, and it's really been helpful. You know, I rail a little bit against the phones, but holy, all my guys in the hills got phones. The poorest people in the world are those poor Cubans in the hills. Somehow they got phones, you know. And then we've helped them out too to get some more, because everybody talks every day. You know, what they need. Where's the seed? I need yucca seed. I can't find it in my area. Well, we got some over here. That's how they're surviving. Operations. Whole hospitals are shut down because there's no surgical gloves. So who's got surgical gloves? Well, my family has a little stash. Okay. Who's got antibiotics? Who's got this? Who's got that? Or who's got the best herbal cures for things? All that's being communicated. So I know I'm certain in my heart it ain't gonna die. If Cuba goes fascist, if Cuba goes oligarchy, if Cuba goes deep communism, my folks are going to survive. My folks know who they are. We were just there. Real nice. That's the work we do. And we moved about a lot of peoples, you know, since we started working. I didn't work with Plenty for about 30 years. Hiatus there, but came back now that I retired from institutional work, and got these two projects going. I'm too old to get into more. We have some good projects in the Andes. We have a lot of good people we've met over the years, you know, that are not just an application for a program. There are faces and people and generations that we know. We knew their grandparents. We knew their parents. We know the young people now. That's indigenous relationship. You got to know where you're coming from, who you are, what is it. Because those are influences. That's what makes who you are, whether you know it or not.